Several years ago, almost 15 years ago, a review in one of the American journals of a book on Indian literary theory, which raised 11 objections to what that learned gentleman thought was an attempt to revive an obsolete, thought system, Sanskrit theories, and because in that article it was claimed that one is talking about Sanskrit theories as an example, literary theories as an example, but what has been said or is being said is about the Sanskrit intellectual systems in all disciplines. So the reviewer thought that this was a vain, fruitless attempt at what he called revivalism. And of course, a rejoinder was written, a long rejoinder, which was published, to which there was no rejoinder, because there couldn't be a rejoinder to a very passionate investigation into the question. The question is very much alive even today. What is the place of Indian learning, Indian intellectual traditions in primarily our universities, in our education system, and ultimately in terms of what it does to the Indian mind, how we think. And in 1984, I think, the government of India, the then government of India, in its wisdom, which was a carefully considered policy of alienating the youth, keeping them, ignorant of what they had inherited, could have inherited, their own knowledge, that government decided that Sanskrit will now in the schools, 8 and 9, it will be an optional, and the students will be asked to choose between Sanskrit, Arabic, Persian, German, French. A school teacher who lost his job as a result of that, he went to the High Court. He didn't get a favorable judgment. He went to the Supreme Court. And then the Supreme Court, I think Ranganathan Justice was the Chief Justice. Some Ranganathan or Rangachari, generally they are Ranganathans or Rangacharis. He was the Chief Justice. And he thought that if he were to take a decision in accordance with his conscience, he may not get any commission to head after his retirement. So he passed on the case to a Sardarji, Justice Kuldeep Singh. One of the happiest things to have happened, because Sardarjis do not calculate too far ahead. And Justice Kuldeep Singh accepted that case, gave a date 6 months later. And in those 6 months, he read Vedas, he read Upanishads, he read major Shastras, he read accepted authorities about Sanskrit thought, Sanskrit tradition, culture, and then he convened the court. And he started in a very interesting way. The judgment is available on the internet. It's a Supreme Court judgment on Sanskrit, case of Sanskrit. He said that many years ago, it was a judge who declared that Sanskrit was the mother language of all languages. And how many years? Almost 170 years later, 1786 to 1993, almost 200 years later, it has again devolved upon a judge to defend it. To defend it. And he said that a culture needs to be defended. And to support that, he quoted Jawaharlal Nehru, who said that as long as India has Sanskrit, India is safe, India's culture is safe. And to defend a culture, you need to work with a language which is the language of your culture. And he said, Sanskrit is not just a language. It is the vocabulary of our thought and culture. The vocabulary of our thought and culture. And he went into the arguments of the advocate Mr. Tulsi, and then Milan Banerjee, I think some of us may remember their names, who had argued that how can we teach Sanskrit in that way? We will have to teach Lepcha also. Which and the advocate himself said many people have not even heard of this language, Lepcha. So Justice Kuldeep Singh asked many very interesting questions. He said, do they teach Sanskrit in Iraq? No. Do they teach Sanskrit in Iran? He said, no. Then why do you feel compelled to teach them along with Sanskrit here? And then he went into the definitions of secularism that were enshrined in an earlier Supreme Court judgment to show, and concluded, the conclusion is very meaningful, concluded that therefore teaching Sanskrit without teaching Persian, Arabic, German and French is not against secularism. Now that reminded me that, in Ramayana there is a very interesting episode. Angad, when he goes to Ravan's court, so Ravan tells him that, look, your father was such a strong man, brave man, and because Ravan had been, kept like this by Bali. So, and you are just following this fellow who is an ascetic, and in any case he has lost his wife and he is very demoralized. And his brother is also demoralized because his brother is demoralized. And you have become their follower. What is all this? When he says that Angad, forcefully puts his foot on the ground. And Ravan almost tumbles. And then there is a dialogue in which Angad says, Vachal, is Kadali only a tree? Is Ganga only a river? Is Rama only a Purush? So I thought that since this problem was not there, he would have also added, do you think Sanskrit is only a language? That you can talk about it along with German, French, Lepcha and other things. But the question, why till 1950, Sanskrit had during British period particularly, for all that people say, there were certain very good things about them. Some of them at least were so enamored by Indian thought that they became great students of Indian thought. So till 1950, Sanskrit had a fairly good, important place in Indian education. They had introduced the system, Sanskrit will be compulsory in the schools for 2 years. It will be there as a major subject. And Calcutta University Department of Sanskrit was one of the major departments of research. And great, scholars worked on the primary texts and translations and wrote learned treatises on that. It all died. Once we became free, what do we call independence, and what Punjabis call partition. The day we were partition, you see, one part of our mind, it became more subordinate, more subjugated than it was earlier. And after 1950, maybe sometimes I think it was a matter of state policy that if your young people discover their roots, they regain their self-respect, you see, and they start walking with erect shoulders, then the political dispensation that is there may have to pay a price. So the formula of running the country, they added something to the British formula. The British formula was very simple, divide. And they kept on dividing further. Some caste and then OBC, then the creamy OBC and then the non-creamy OBC, and then they can think of all kinds of layers. They kept on dividing, and to that they added to reorient the education in such a way that the young people begin to accept that all the original thinking is done there in the West, and that we are merely recipients. They knew, because in 1957 a very powerful commission was set up by the government of India to go into the role and status and review of Sanskrit studies in India. It was led by Suniti Kumar Chatterjee, Dandekar was a member, and Dave was a member. You see, all the big scholars of the time, they were members. And their recommendations are remarkable. In fact, some of us should go to the internet and see those. I say, all that needs to be said and all that needs to be done for Sanskrit was said by them in 1957. All that we need to do today is to pressurize the government to implement their own commission. Nothing new is needed. There is not time. I could read out the recommendations. You see what all they said. They left out nothing virtually. And this was with the support of the Constitution. Because remember, in the Constituent Assembly, two persons had argued for Sanskrit as the national language. Ambedkar and Tajuddin Ahmed. Very few people know. And who opposed it? Our great friend Jawaharlal Nehru. Not only not Hindi, but English also. You see? And this is the sad history of why the kind of the whole thing was derailed. The education was derailed. So they added education to that policy. Now what did they do? They carefully arranged things in such a way in the name of, again, something they had learned. Macaulay was wise. He connected education with employment, and he connected education with English. So English was connected with employment. And you will agree this is true even today. English is connected with employment. So they saw to it that the English language not only continued, but spread wider, thereby creating the two Indias, the other India being larger than the small India which is on the top. By excluding and marginalizing Sanskrit intellectual systems, they transformed a donor, they abandoned the donor tradition and introduced or effected in practice what I call a Katora culture. You know Katora culture? Mahmood, in one of the Hindi films on the river in Singapore, singing "De de Allah ke naam de de, international fakir aaye hai." And you will agree, from wheat to every idea we borrowed. And Sanskrit is even today a donor tradition. Which books, learned books are exported most to the European and Western countries? Adi Shankaracharya's commentaries, not Kapil Kapoor's books. Adi Shankaracharya's commentaries. And they are still, you see, the seminal Sanskrit texts, Harvard Oriental series, 193 volumes, translations of Indian classical texts. Max Muller series, 53, 54, I am now, don't remember the exact number. At the end of 19th and late 20th century, the West translated the vast Sanskrit knowledge systems into English, into some other European languages later. And enriched them, enriched, because you can't fault them. It's not blame them. The entire 19th century Europe took to Sanskrit studies thanks to Dara Shikoh. Dara Shikoh translated Upanishads into Persian. And one of the translations, it went to Dupont in France. He translated it into French. Then it went into Italian, then German. And by 1808, all major universities of Europe had a chair in Sanskrit. And they replaced their understanding of Hebrew as the source language by Sanskrit as the source language. And in fact also wound up several departments of Arabic. In 19th century Europe, every bright young man was doing Sanskrit as our bright young men are doing computer and commerce. To no great effect, but still in the hope that one will get a good job. A different matter that now a computer IT gentleman, a boy gets over 2,000 to 3,000 rupees because they are dime a dozen now. So they were doing that. And you name all the European thinkers, Nietzsche, Schiller, Schelling, Schopenhauer, they were all either Sanskritists or students of Sanskrit thought. As Max Miller, much maligned Max Miller, I don't go with people who, say he was propagating, because you see, look, his chair was funded by Christian missions. And he was, naturally, they were the employers. So once in a while he would write a letter to his mother or something that I am translating the Rig Veda so that people discover what a stupid book it is. So that way I will damage Hinduism. But look at his translation. In fact, he revived Rig Vedic studies in India. And in one of my studies, articles, I call him the 29th Vyasa. Because every time the Indian literature was lost through external or internal causes, somebody came to recover, to retrieve, and reconstitute the text. Because as Max Muller notes, if all the copies of Rig Veda are lost, you can reconstruct the text from the minds of the people. Because in India, in the oral Sanskrit tradition, we have constituted, maintained, and transmitted knowledge through the mind, and not through external materials like paper or now CDs and DVDs. Even CD, DVD, as some of you know, can go bad. I mean, it's fine, and one day you start, it just doesn't open. But a Panditji sitting there like our friend Alvayarji, you never know what knowledge he has. But his knowledge is intact, and he will transmit it. For 5,000 years, Rig Veda has come down intact, with not a word out of place. While Shakespeare's plays, composed in the early 16th century, in spite of Caxton Press, have yielded to major scholarship, modern scholarship, textual scholarship. Is this line by Shakespeare? Is this by Marlowe? But for 5,000 years, massive literature, all by oral tradition, memory, mnemonic methods, come down intact. So the Sanskrit knowledge culture, which has come down to us almost intact, was totally excluded and marginalized. And the result is that our education today, the young people who come out of the universities and schools, at best they are ignorant, and at worst they have contempt for themselves. कुछ नहीं है जी, सब बेकार है, पुरानी बातें हो गई हैं अब ये, इससे अब क्या होगा, जमाना बहुत आगे निकल गया है. The other day in Delhi, I was invited by IPF people to chair where every learned professor said, जमाना बहुत आगे निकल गया है, one media man also, and ये, तो then I tried to show them जमाना कितना आगे निकल गया है, because I am associated with a rural university in Haryana, sir. You are most welcome. And it is just 100 kilometers from Delhi. It is the other India. You see, I go out in the morning, people greet me, Ram Ram ji. In Delhi, if I say Ram Ram ji, somebody will get an FIR done. ये सारा fundamentalist है. Everybody says Ram Ram ji and greets me. In the evening, I go. One day I went. It was late evening, and the young drivers of the university vehicles, they used to see me and do this. Then one of them came because we're dusky, and he said, "Sir, kahan ja rahe ho aap?" I said, "I am going to the chemist outside." Okay, why, you are not well? No, I am okay. My wife needs some medicine. Sir, I'll come with you. I said, why? If you don't get it here, I'll go and get it from Gohana, 13 kilometers. In Delhi, where I stay, I told them, in the same society, for 28 flats, there is a lift. When I enter there, or anybody enter, nobody greets each other. We are enemies, because we delay each other by entering the lift when they were about to press the switch. They would have gone so much, and now I have held them down there. So, zamana bahut aage nikal gaya hai, because we have abandoned so many things. We don't teach our children to value them. We don't value them ourselves, except perhaps at my age, where it matters. You see, that a young man insists that I take his seat at night in the train, and if a young man insists, then one's faith in one's own younger generation is also restored, that things are not so bad. See, so at best ignorant, at worst contempt for themselves. So much ignorance. पांडव के कितने बेटे थे? 5 बेटे थे जी. कौन कौन से? एक था भीम, एक उसका बड़ा भाई, एक छोटा भाई, 2 का नाम भूल गया. But ask them about Michael Jackson. They'll tell you everything. His children and siblings and so on and so on. This is about the young. What about the intellectuals, so-called? You see, intellectuals are translated in buses in Delhi by ordinary people as बुद्धिजीवी. बुद्धिजीवीज are जो बुद्धि बेच के जीविका कमाते हैं. You see, they say that. ये बुद्धिजीवी है, ये बुद्धि बेच के जीवी, इससे कुछ भी कहलवा लो. You pay him some money, he will say what you want to say, he'll prove it. He'll prove it. So बुद्धिजीवी हैं, उनका क्या हुआ? Many years ago, these are now, I've been talking about these things for so long that I myself become a little tired of these things, because it has not made much difference. You see, I used to say de-intellectualization. What has been done by the education is to de-intellectualize India. And because the Indian Academy, it entered into a data theory relationship with the West, what Sir was also saying, that we get every theory from there, every concept from there, all logic from there, and we read a paper, something, and then we take our own village and, give the data to say how right this scholar is, hoping that he will catch the eye and make a visit to USA on some pretext. Because for long, so were the values distorted, that the greatest tragedy that could strike our young people was refusal of American visa. Things are changing now. Things are changing now, and not only because of us, but also because of what is happening there and elsewhere. But this was the situation. So intellectuals de-intellectualized. A friend of mine, a Sardarji, Sardarjis are good friends of mine. I am also half Sardarji from Punjab. Professor, he said, Indian intellectual is like the broiler chicken. Broiler. A broiler, वो आप लोग यहाँ शायद कम खाते हो, ब्रॉयलर जो बड़े ब्यूटीफुल हेल्दी चिकन होते हैं, वाइट with red kalgi, and they are fed a particular diet to make them fat, and so that then they are eaten. So they look very impressive, very healthy. The problem is they can't stand on their legs. So Indian intellectuals are like broilers. They are fed on a special diet, the Western theory, and they are very impressive because they learn a few words which they smatter in their discourse, like a good housewife smatters the dhania and jeera and this, you see, like marginalized, the center doesn't hold, and fundamental, and the essentialism, a few more words. I, of course, deconstruct, decode, deconstruct, decode. So whatever you are saying, you just throw these words here and there, and you become an impressive broiler chicken. The only problem is that these people, when they go abroad, many of my students from JNU, they used to take my certification and go and get admissions and fellowship. And then I would immediately get an email, sir, they want me to talk about Indian aesthetics. Can you tell me what should I say? Because they don't know. They want me to talk about Indian philosophy, and they don't know, they didn't know that India had a philosophy or a philosophical system to count. So they expect them to talk about India, but they know nothing about India. They are broilers. So the education system produced young people with lack of confidence and self-respect, and brazenly arrogant, foolish intellectual adults. Brazenly arrogant. You see, again dismissive and all that. They have spread in order to keep this system going, so that Sanskrit doesn't get a bigger... I don't mean Sanskrit. You see, I myself am a professor of English, and I never studied Sanskrit in school. But by my natural professional, movement, which was, thanks to JNU, possible. JNU, for all its ills, was a remarkable place that it gave complete freedom to the teacher. I used to teach Panini's Ashtadhyayi in an MA English program. And Panini's Ashtadhyayi is not taught completely even in Sanskrit departments. But I could do that. So JNU, thanks to JNU, I moved a lot. And I developed my own reading competence in Sanskrit. But when I'm talking of Sanskrit, I'm talking of the Sanskrit knowledge traditions, and knowledge which is there. This is massive. This is massive. I'll come to that a little later. First, this Buddhijeevi class, in order to maintain the system, why are they feel threatened by this. They feel threatened if it surfaces. You see, linguistics department, I was a very important member of linguistics in India, and I tried to tell my friends that you are members of the UGC. Of course, they took care never to make me a member of any committee, because you see, I will disturb the American harmony, the phoneme, the morpheme, the underlying structure, transformation. Because I come up with Panini, who said there is no transformation, it's only substitution. So the fundamental philosophical differences are there, systems are different. So I told them, introduce some Indian linguistics, because at least in linguistics, you have an attested authority, Panini, everybody accepts, NASA accepts. But no, it doesn't find a place in any syllabus. In philosophy departments, Indian philosophy departments, you have, say, 10 courses, then 9 courses are on Western philosophy, and in one course you have half comparison, soul or Atma ka comparison karo, Atma and soul, compare, and that's done. Indian philosophy is done. You see, like that. So this was sustained. Why? Because, as I said, they feel threatened. Because if it comes, it's a huge textual system. Important thing is that Sanskrit thought systems are textual systems. You have continuous, unbroken, cumulative tradition of texts and thinkers. For example, in grammar, from 7th century BC to 1795, Nagesh Bhatt in Karnataka. Continuous thinking in texts of grammar. So if they allow this, a professor of linguistics who has been phonemicizing and morphemicizing for so many years, he will have to shut his shop for some years in order to read these things. So they didn't do it. They felt, as I said, they felt threatened. So they developed all kinds of arguments why Sanskrit or Sanskrit thought should not be given a central place. Now some of those 4 or 5, what is being said, myths about Sanskrit, I would mention, we all are aware, but I like to mention them. First of all, they say Sanskrit was not a spoken language at any time. You must have heard people say that Sanskrit was never a spoken language. Now, a language which was not spoken has produced the world's largest body of literature. And epic, which is the world's largest, and an epic which is metrical. That means an epic which was recited, which is recitative. Now, how do you recite an epic to people who don't speak the language? How can that happen? Then secondly, the grammar of Sanskrit, Panini's grammar, he doesn't say I'm writing a grammar of Sanskrit. Sanskrit was a name given to the language by Bhas in 5th century. This name is never used. He says, I am writing, in fact, Patanjali explains, he is writing a grammar of Bhasha. Bhasha from Bhasha. Bhasha from making noise. You see? And generally the word is used for the barking of dogs. So most of the time when people are talking a language, they are just like doing that. And then if they are doing something meaningful, then we say Vak. And if they are saying something meaningful in a musical, in an attractive manner, then we say Vani. So Panini is writing a grammar of Bhasha. And Vaidiki. Vaidiki means compositional language. So he is writing a grammar of spoken language and written language. Now what was the point of doing a language of spoken? Because he talks about the pitch levels, he talks about accents, he talks about the pace of speech in his grammar. Now all this applies to spoken language, not written language. So people say this was never spoken language. And thirdly, in Ashtadhyayi, a large section on Sandhi. Sandhi जब सुना है, जब adjacent sounds होते हैं, वो मिल जाते हैं बोलने में. Maha Indra, Mahendra, A. Now this is a phenomena of speech. And a elaborate section on Sandhi in Ashtadhyayi. And yet they say it was never the spoken language. The Valmiki Ramayana is such beautiful recitative poetry. You see, it's recited. Its basic function is to be recited. Indian oral, all these texts are oral. It doesn't matter that you write manuscripts of them or you print a Mahabharata. Mahabharata remains an oral text because it is metrical, it is structured, highly structured musically. And portions and parts are recited here and there in folk performances with or without variation. So there is one Ramayana, Valmiki, but there are 1,000 Ramakathas, variations. And all the performative literature of India is links directly to this literature. There is no, in fact, the division between popular and learned is not a real distinction in any sphere of culture. So whether it is a dance, in dances, the popular folk dances and the learned dances, the source is the same Natya Shastra, Bharat Muni ka Natya Shastra. So this is kept out, and the myth is that it is not a spoken language. As if, we are speaking wonderful spoken language. The kind of public language India has today, which you see and hear on the television, is a very bad public language. We are now having very bad public language, offensive. While Hyun Sang, when he came to India, he leaves a record in his book that the people, of course about Jalandhar people, you see, I am from Amritsar, 40 kilometers from Jalandhar. Of course, the Jalandhar people speak very roughly. They do it even today, the Punjabis there. So because Punjabi language sounds very rough to people who are not used to the language. Of course, to Punjabis it sounds very sweet. Like Tamil, it sounds very rough to Punjabis, but to Tamil people it is very sweet. So languages have that property. But he says the moment you cross Yamuna, and you are in the middle of Desha, the speech is so sweet. Not today. You cross the Yamuna, you go to Ghaziabad, Meerut, travel. Language is not speech. It has declined, deteriorated. So the public speech, as if we are speaking, so we are going to study the language, and they were not speaking, so we will not study that language. And then there is, in fact, it's a big subject. They say, in fact, there was another language which was the spoken language. from which the later languages, Pali, Prakrita, Apabhranshas arose. But they have no understanding of how languages develop. The point is that a spoken language produces literature. Literature which it produces gets frozen. The compositional language freezes. You get my point? For example, T.S. Eliot's English. You have read Eliot's poems? Huh? T.S. Eliot's English. Do you think people spoke that English? No. An ordinary Englishman in London didn't use German words and Greek words and learned words and didn't speak in those long sentences and patterns in speech. You don't speak like that. But can you say that he wrote in a language which was not spoken? No. He wrote in English, which was spoken in those days. So every language has a Prakrita, that is the natural variety, and Samsakrita, the selected language in which a composer or a writer composes. So Eliot's English is Sanskrit English, and it is from the Prakrit English which was spoken at that time in London. That is what holds in Indian texts also. The Vedas were compositional, very important knowledge texts, not sacred, because in the Hindu traditions there is no sacred text. So you can freely burn the Vedas, tear them, no problems. In fact, because they were opposed and criticized right from the beginning by materialist skeptics, the Vedas were criticized and from the beginning. That's why they have survived, because every time some very extraordinary mind criticized the Vedas, some equally extraordinary mind came up to defend and explain. So when Kautsa and other very strong thinkers, they said the Vedic mantras are meaningless. Meaningless. Somebody they say there is one Rudra, at other point they say 1,000 Rudras. Then they say don't pile fire in the sky. They say what nonsense, you can't pile fire in the sky. So what is the point of saying don't pile fire in the sky? You see? Or they say they have tautology, they have incoherence, and they have words which have lost their clarity, because words, they become opaque after some time, they go out of use. So then Yaska, 9th century BC, from Gujarat, Nagarparkar, Om Paraskaraya Nama, that tradition says, he sat down to answer them. That Vedic mantras, kya Ved mantra nirarthak hai? He said, no. No linguistic utterance can be meaningless. Now this was, so many centuries before Wittgenstein time. No linguistic utterance can be meaningless. You have to make sense of it. So much later, our friend Chomsky, he said, green ideas sleep furiously. Meaningless, yes, but not to a poet, nor to a madman, nor to a child. For a child also it is very meaningful. So you have to make sense. They cannot be meaningful. So the great minds arose. Just for example, he took up all the objections. Don't pile fire in the sky, Kautsa said. What does it mean? Proscribing the impossible. What is the sense of proscribing the impossible? He said, well, at least once in her lifetime, every young mother tells her infant who can't even turn, when she puts the infant down, the young mother says, don't run away, I am coming. He says at least once every young mother says this. No, it's not meaningless. She is one, it is sheer love. She is seeing him grown up and running, and she is expressing her protection for the baby. And then she just wants to communicate because the child loves to hear her voice. You see? So it's not meaningless. In the same way, proscription of the impossible is not meaningless. So like that, great minds arose and defended. So Vedas remain alive even today. And you will agree, they don't lack critics and opponents. Many people say, ji, padhne nahi dete the, us zamane mein, which is a doubtful statement. Adhyayan was never varjit. Adhyayana. Recitation was varjit. Because recitation, a really religious ritual, required a certain level of competence. And for that you had to undergo long training, 9 years, 10 years, 12 years. In any case, I accept कि कुछ लोगों को पढ़ने नहीं देते थे. देन आई टेल देम, अब पढ़ लो, 200 रुपए में मिलते हैं. अब तो पंडित भी नहीं पढ़ते क्योंकि कठिन बड़े हैं. एक लाइन पहली पढ़ लीजिए ऋग्वेद की, समझ ही नहीं आती. तो उसके लिए द ट्रेडिशन से 14 विद्याएं आनी चाहिए, 6 वेदांग आने चाहिए. यू हैव टू बी ए मास्टर ऑफ 6 ऑक्सिलरी साइंसेस. यू सी, ग्रामर, फोनेटिक्स, etymology, sociology, astronomy, mathematics, plus the other vidyas. Once you are master of 14, you are an adhikari, then you can understand Vedas. 14 विद्या पढ़ने का टाइम किसको है? कोटेशन का जमाना है ना? यूटिलिटेरियन रीडिंग का जमाना है. हमारे जमाने में प्रोफेसर एक किताब बताता था, हम बड़े ध्यान से उसको पढ़ते थे. लाइब्रेरी से जाना, जेरोक्सिंग नहीं थी, फोटोस्टैट नहीं था. So luckily we would book the book. Books needed to be booked, prescribed books. तो वो मिलती थी, उसको पढ़ते थे, एक एक लाइन पढ़ते थे, ध्यान से नोट्स लेते थे, समझते थे. आजकल पाउडरिंग योर नोज, लाइब्रेरी गए, कौन सी को एक कोटेशन चाहिए इस पेपर के लिए, तो कुछ ले देखा, पेड़ निकाला, उसको फोटोकॉपी किया, या ज़्यादा टाइम नहीं है, सारी किताब फोटोकॉपी की रख दी, कि फिर पढ़ेंगे. सो आवर स्टूडेंट्स हु यूज्ड टू बी ग्रेट रीडर्स, they became great Xeroxers. And now they have become great scrollers and searchers. है ना? Search and scroll. 3 घंटे लग जाते हैं, कुछ नहीं मिलता, सोचते आज बड़ा काम कर लिया, अब कॉफी पीते हैं, थक गए तो जा कॉफी पीते हैं. So it's gone out. The book reading is different. So they don't read any of the books anymore. In the Sanskrit tradition, a book has to be read because these books are very small. You will be amazed. Ashtadhyayi, the only complete descriptive rule-bound grammar of a natural human language, is composed in 32,000 syllables, not even words. Syllables. 5 पेज में छप जाती है. You see? So people used to memorize it. At one time they used to memorize with understanding. Now they memorize as a ritual. That's why it doesn't work. But otherwise, imagine that if you have all the texts in your mind, which is part of the oral knowledge culture, then you are quicker than a computer. Quick. A Panditji, traditional Panditji, I met one 86-year-old grammarian, Peri Suryanarayana Shastri, near Tirupati, a village. And for 4 hours he sat erect like. No water, no tea. People like me moving after 1 hour from this side to this. And then pani chahiye, chai chahiye. And you ask him anything. You ask him even about Chomsky's question. He would ask us to explain what is the question. And he'll give you the answer. And he'll give you the answer from Buddhist texts, Jain texts, from grammar, from Dharma Shastras, all the Vangmaya he had here. The human mind was stretched to its capacity. Today the human mind is being atrophied to its maximum capacity, because even multiplication we put on the outside. So my daughter used to say, Papa, what is 5 into 7? I said, yaar, kamal hai. 5 into 7. Hum log to 16 into 3/4 of 15 का भी हमें आता था. So even today when I go to a shop, I am quicker than the shopkeeper in telling what is the total cost. 200 ग्राम टमाटर आजकल इतना ही खरीदते हैं, 200 ग्राम टमाटर, because they become so expensive. CDs are cheaper. So you calculate far more quickly than the calculator. So the knowledge tradition which trained the mind, it was thrown out. And the other myth, I mentioned only one. Myth. The second one is, it was the language of invading Aryans. This was put forward at the time when English was being opposed as a foreign language. So they came up with the argument that in a way all languages of India are foreign, because South Indian, Dravidian people, they were Phoenicians, Mediterranean. They settled in Balochistan for some time, and there is a Dravidian dialect in Balochistan, and then they came here. So they were foreigners. And Sanskrit, the Aryans came, from somewhere where the white people live even today, Caspian Sea, beyond Caspian Sea, or the East Europe. And they came here, they brought the language. So it's a foreign language, and it's not native to Indians. Now the question is very simple. Two questions. One, they came. The question is, why did they come if they were so learned? As the great literature which is composed. So the answer is, they came because India had good libraries. The invading Aryans came because they wanted to compose great literature in Sanskrit, and for that they needed libraries. And the libraries are only in India. Can there be anything more ridiculous? Secondly, it has been shown there is no linguistic evidence of movement of Sanskrit from, East Europe to India. There are no traces left anywhere. Today English is here. We can say English brought by the English-speaking people. And we have the evidence. Because English-speaking people are there in England. Even today, they are in America. So English was brought here. But suppose English was here and nowhere else. Then what will you say? English was brought by invading Irishmen? You can't say that. So this is the second myth. कि भाई foreigners का है, तो foreigners की language है, so what? So what if English is foreigner? And then the third myth was that it is the language of gods. So when in JNU we set up an independent center, and I convinced the university to make it separate from the School of Languages, autonomous. So they asked me why you do this. You see, that separate. I said, you say this is the language of gods. So how can we be in a school which deals with languages of men? So it's your argument. It's the language of gods. Now, a Maharashtrian poet of 1st century AD said, if Sanskrit is the language of gods, is Maharashtrian a language of thieves? Chora? Because in Telugu, for rice is called chora. So Kumaril Bhatt said that he was a Telugu. He said, why should we speak the language of Magadha? Same standard language as Magadha. Because Magad people, they call rice chora, but chora is, they call chor a thief. But our word for chor is, rice is chora. So words are different, things are different. So we'll not. This was the debate about what is a standard language, standard Sanskrit. Of course, there can be, Indian mind has always been against imposing a standard. So all search for a standard Ramayana Katha, standard Mahabharata, authentic, standard of speech. It doesn't apply in a pluralistic country like India. And the next myth that we have here is, again by the Buddhijeevis, that it was Brahmanical. This is the most abused idea. The Brahmins. Why? Because the attested 3 intellectual, collaborative, confrontational schools in India were the Buddhist, Jaina and Brahman Sampradayas. Brahman Sampradaya, Bauddha Sampradaya or Jaina Sampradaya. Now everybody read that Brahman as Brahmin, caste. But it's not caste. Brahman Sampradaya is the school of philosophy which operates with the category of Brahma, Brahman, which is written as Brahman and in Roman, and which is in this accusative case it is Brahman. Brahman, object of. Brahman is the Vedantic category of Brahma. So Brahman Sampradaya, and they were also called the grammarians. So they operated with the Brahma. Brahmanical, Brahmano ka hai. So I asked one person, यार महाभारत ब्राह्मणों का ग्रंथ है? कहा हाँ जी, और किसका है? तो उन्होंने कहा वेद व्यास वाज एन इलेजिटिमेट चाइल्ड, जिसने लिखा। ब्राह्मण छोड़ो, वो तो पता नहीं कौन सी कास्ट में आएगा आपके हिसाब से। बिकॉज एज फार एज आई अंडरस्टैंड, कास्ट डिड नॉट मैटर इन ऋषियों की और नदियों का उद्गम, ओरिजिन कोई नहीं पूछता इस देश में कि ये कौन है, जात क्या है, कोई नहीं पूछता। पर आप पूछते हो तो हम आपसे पूछते हैं वेद व्यास क्या था? वो पराशर ऋषि और सत्यवती डॉटर ऑफ द फिशरमैन इलेजिटिमेट चाइल्ड था. एंड द एपिक इज अबाउट द कुरुस डायनेस्टी, हाफ इलेजिटिमेट. सब नियोग से पैदा हुए बच्चे हैं. वो कौन थे? ब्राह्मण थे. हैज एनीबडी इन महाभारत डिस्क्राइब्ड एनी कैरेक्टर एज ए ब्राह्मण कैरेक्टर? नो, है ही नहीं. अच्छा, ब्राह्मण डायनेस्टीज इंडिया में कितनी हुई? कितने रूलर्स हुए ब्राह्मण? एक शुंग डायनेस्टी एक्सेप्शनल, बिकॉज मौर्याज ने इतनी धांधली की 300 साल दैट देयर वाज ए रिएक्शन. बट शुंगास एंड दैट्स ऑल. कोई ब्राह्मण डायनेस्टी नहीं, कोई ब्राह्मण रूलर्स नहीं. और इन द लास्ट 1000 years, द भक्ति पीरियड, विच इन द कोर्ट पीपल आर्ग्यूड दैट बहुत इनजस्टिस हुआ हमारे समाज के साथ. इन द लास्ट 1000 years, the greatest bhakti poets were from other castes. Other castes. And none of them has written about caste injustice. So, this whole notion of Brahmanical needs to be debunked in a forthright manner. What do you mean by Brahmanical? Brahmin by caste? It's not. It cannot be. And then finally, you have this opposition between Sanskrit and Indian languages. Great scholars like our friend Ganesh Devi, that Sanskrit has no connection with Indian languages. So when you point out that in Punjabi 95% of vocabulary is Sanskrit, least in Tamil 71%, 84% in Malayalam, 82% in Telugu, 86% in Bengali and Assamese. How do you explain that? They say it is by borrowing. You see? Now if you have any understanding, you know that you are trying to politically argue something, that's all. So this notion of no relationship between, I give you an example of a dialect of Punjabi. This is spoken in the area where Musharraf ruled, near Islamabad, Rawalpindi. It is called Pothohari dialect of the Plateau. I am going to speak that Punjabi. Tuam kutar gatsain. Tuam kutar gatsain. Those who know Sanskrit, don't you know it is Sanskrit? Tuam kutar gatsi. That is Sanskrit. And even today they say Tuam kutar gatsain. Multani language is half Sanskrit. Even today, the Siraiki language. And there are words in Punjabi which are a direct continuity from the Rig Veda, but which are not found in any other Indian language. So what are they talking? That it has no relationship. Modern Indian languages, even the language family business, I believe, but it has gone beyond the alphabet of Indian languages. Alphabet. Even Tamil, Malayalam, Telugu, Kannada, the alphabet of all Indian languages comes from the map which was prepared in 3rd, 4th century BC by Katyayana in Vajaseni Pratishakya. He has made a table. It is in Chomskyan terms, it's a very powerful model, powerful structure. That means every language needs less than what it has. So languages choose. So some languages have both tata, other they make the difference between tata. In Tamil, like tata ka phase nahi hai, hamare yahan hai. So languages choose from that template. So that is the large template prepared by Katyayana. And all language alphabets are from their Indian languages. So these are some of the myths. I'll now quickly, I think I must, but then you call me again later. We all have Hanuman syndrome. You know what is Hanuman syndrome? हनुमान जी लंका में बैठे थे ना, जब सीता को ढूंढना था, सब वानर बैठे हैं, हनुमान जी पीछे बैठे थे, ऐसे मुंह नीचा करके, बिकॉज जामवंत वाज आस्किंग कौन जाएगा श्रीलंका, नोबडी आंसरिंग. देन जामवंत सेड के अब हम बूढ़े हो गए हैं, जब जवान थे तो 3 बार आते जाते थे लंका. क्यों जाते थे ये नहीं बताया, 3 बार आते जाते थे, अब जा तो सकते हैं पर वापस नहीं आ सकते. तो कोई तो बोलो, बट वी इंडियंस हैव द हैबिट, नोबडी वॉलंटियर्स. Except in the grand case of Guru Gobind Singh, where he asked for 5 persons to give their heads. You know, Panj Pyaras and the Khalsa, and the first one was from Odisha, the second one was from Andhra, third one was from Gujarat, fourth one was a Jat from Meerut, and only the fifth one is a person of my caste from Punjab. And this was being done in Punjab. So Panj Pyaras, now they have owned them as their own, but they were all over India, because Guru Granth Sahib is in fact India's gift to Punjab, because the Bani of so many saints is part of that text. So the Indians don't volunteer. So Jamban said, Hanuman, you get up. Why are you silent? Do you know? Have you forgotten what your strength is? And then he reminded him, because he was cursed. When he was small, he used to throw the rishis in the Ganga. So the rishis cursed him, you forget your strength, till somebody reminds you. And then Jamant reminded him, and then Hanuman grew. So we are all Indians suffering from the Hanuman syndrome. We've forgotten what our strength is and don't value it. But the value is immense. As Sir said, you see, people are working here and there in all their own different ways. And India is like an ocean. In the ocean, there are so many waves, and you never know what will be the shape of the surface after some time. So in the same way, India is a self-governing country. It works in spite of the government and in spite of the organized systems. People's dynamism drives it. And things are happening all over. 30 years ago, when I started talking of these things, 35 years ago, people in 1974, people used to walk out of my lectures. They used to say, this is all obsolete, this is Sanskritization, new knowledge has taken its place. But today, even the Marxist states and universities want to hear these things. So things are changing. Things are bad. Dharmpalji should not have been gone into such depression, because things are happening. They don't appear to be happening, but as I said, it's like the ocean. Someday it will show. Well, thank you very much. I'll stop here.